Let's pick over the results of this election, because you look at the primary votes of both the major parties. Labor's still relatively and historically low, but the Liberal Party, much lower historically, and they really need to increase that to have any chance of being the party of government. But let's pick over this, as I say, with Redbridge Group Director Simon Welsh. Simon, thanks so much for your time. Redbridge's final track poll did show that Labor was well on track for majority government. YouGov poll, even the last news poll, showed that majority was the most likely outcome for Labor. But there were polls, including now the internal polling, that showed that the Liberal Party could still pick up 10 seats. How do you get such disparate results in polling?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Look, I think park the internal polling, because quite simply I don't know enough about it and wouldn't really want to comment on it. But if the reports are true, clearly they just got it wrong. I think what's interesting is I think the polling, as you rightly said, is all around the mark. There's always variation between polls and the timing and methodology and all those sorts of things. What I think has happened here, and what I think has sort of made the result on the polls at the margin end of best possible outcome for Labor. The way you translate national polls into particular seat counts is very tricky. So there's always a band of, if Labor has a really good night, it might be at one end. If Labor has a really bad night, it might be at the other end. And it's obviously landed at the end of Labor had a really good night based on those numbers. And I think what's happened here is we knew that there was, significant stress, anxiety, pain in the electorate. And you and I have discussed this now for 3 years, that has been building. It hasn't gone away. But what seems to have happened here is that through the combination of an excellent Labor campaign, and let's not underestimate that, and I might come back to that in a second, and the poor Liberal campaign, is that anxiety, that angst in the electorate seems to have landed on the Liberal Party, not on the government. That through, as I say, through this very clever campaign, I think they've managed to sort of push or divert that risk and anxiety onto the Liberals, aided and abetted by the Liberals, particularly the policy platform. So what we saw through the focus groups in the dying days was this idea that, there was a lot of band-aids being thrown around that didn't excite people too much, but the things that they were really remembering, the things that they were sticking in their minds were the things that worried them, and the things that worried them were wholly on the Liberal side. So, if you were worried about nuclear, you were really worried about nuclear. If you were worried about super for housing, you were really worried about super for housing. If you were worried about deporting dual citizens and offended by that because you're a dual citizen, you were really offended by that. So all those stars aligned, I think. And as I say, Labor has obviously very, very cleverly put the resources in the campaign to sort of get the outsized swings. So the swings that were well above the national average have all come precisely in the areas where they needed them to come. I'm sure there's some results in there that were a surprise to them, but the bulk of that doesn't happen by accident. I think it's an excellent campaign by Labor, and as I say, with those vulnerabilities around policy, let alone the communication then within the Liberal pile.
So people were worried about Trump. They don't want to become America, and Dutton and the Liberal Party represented a risk of that. Nuclear wasn't unpopular because of the danger of nuclear. They were able to mount a campaign around the cost. On the plus side for Labor, they kept on talking about Medicare and wanting to secure that. Even though the Liberals had matched them on Medicare, there was that history of Peter Dutton being Health Minister wanting a co-payment that was enough to kind of scare people, at least not swing them the other way. You talk about dual citizens. I would also add to that Chinese spies, that comment made in the campaign. It seems the Liberal Party still doesn't make the distinction between Chinese Australians and China as a whole. Chinese people in Australia see themselves as Australian, and what has always been conventional wisdom, I think, from both parties over the years, is that you never attack Chinese people. You attack, if you want to attack China and their secrecy and their levelling up in the region, you attack the regime.
Yeah, I think that clearly looks like it's been a big mistake. If we're just sort of picking through the results yesterday, and you can see Box Hill in Melbourne, which is, has a high proportion of Chinese voters, are amongst now the safest Labor booths in the country. You're talking about a two-party preferred in those booths of sort of averaging around 70%. So if Menzies falls, it could be well because of that. The other thing I'll just say quickly on nuclear is nuclear. For folk that were really worried about nuclear, and that included a lot of Liberal voters. I shouldn't say a lot of Liberal voters, but enough Liberal voters. That issue was enough to be vote shifting. If you were really worried about it, you were really worried about it. But the other thing it did was it gave a proof point to the Mediscare campaign. It gave a motivation for why Dutton and the Liberals might cut Medicare when they came in, that otherwise probably wouldn't have been there, because as you rightly said, their policy was to match Labor. But what we saw in our qual work was that one of the messages that was really cutting through was that the cost of nuclear is going to have to come from somewhere.
Yeah, heat cuts you pay. I think it was really, that had real cut through, just like when Bill Shorten was running, the bill you can't afford. It was simple, cut through. There was no equivocation on what the meaning of that was. I also quickly want to touch on a few other things. Nuclear being one of them, of course. It was the cost and where the Liberal Party was going to find the money to pay for it. I mean, if the Liberal Party and National Party are mulling over where to go from here, I think that they have to return to those liberal values that they're talking about so much at the moment, but not intervening in the market. I mean, make it considerable. I mean, and let the market decide. Remove that nuclear barrier, that legislative nuclear barrier, and let the market decide. That might be a little bit more palatable for people. But this was essentially going to be state-owned. The other thing that we have talked about so much is work from home. Now, I've been looking at some of the results on those outer suburbs, and even though this was only ever going to be for the public service, it was a values proposition, wasn't it? I mean, it's quite extraordinary that the Australian public don't realise that a government perhaps can't direct private companies to order everyone back to the office. That is up to private companies, but it didn't matter. It was kind of the value of it, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. But people were saying to us in the groups that even if they so they were saying to us, yeah, look, we get that it's just for Commonwealth public servants. The problem is if the Prime Minister of Australia is standing up there saying you've got to return to work, it becomes really hard for me to have that conversation with my employer. Literally talking about that in the group. So yeah, that was a multi-edged kind of problem for them, because in the midst of cost of living crisis, working from home is a cost of living solution. Don't underestimate that. Like it is a significant cost savings to households on travel, childcare, those sorts of things. But it was also a particularly gendered issue, and the way it came across in the campaign was a particularly gendered issue.
What do you mean like that? Were they taking it? Were women in particular taking that as, we're being branded as lazy here for not wanting to go back in the office, but we're just trying to have a job, pay the mortgage, and manage the household?
That's it. Those comments about the job sharing, women can job share if they've got kids and responsibilities. Yeah, you sound like one of the participants in our focus groups, Laura. That was the kind of response we were getting.
Right. Let me just quickly ask you about, we'll go back to where we started and why it is so difficult to poll, because you see where the primary vote is at for both the major parties. The Greens, if you look at across the board, their vote is actually pretty stable, if not up somewhat, but they've still lost a couple of seats, and the Greens leader Adam Bandt could lose a couple of seats. So when you're polling and looking at these numbers, of course you're taking into account preferences, but as a polling company, is that getting harder and harder to predict from election to election? Big story here, the independents. I mean, look at Bean.
Yes. Yeah, it is absolutely getting harder and harder to go from headline national polls to individual seats, even going from key seat track like we were doing for the News Limited to a more general thing is becoming difficult, because it is there is still a patchiness. And so there's still a patchiness in this result. As you pointed out, Labor is under pressure in strange areas like Fremantle to an independent. If you told me, if you had told me, I was just going to say, if you told me before the day that Labor could well lose Bendigo and Labor could well lose Fremantle, I'd be thinking, gee, if they're underwater there, then there's a whole bunch of other seats that they'd be underwater on. You certainly wouldn't be thinking they'd be winning Northern Tasmania. So yeah, going from those national polls to specific seats is becoming incredibly difficult. And even the predictive methods we have around that are, their models and their predictions. And as we say, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So you hope that the broad trend is right. But yeah, that kind of seat level prediction polling is I think is going to be even incredibly more fraught as we go forward. Because I think, one of the things I think keep an eye on, I'm not saying this will definitely happen, but I said keeping an eye on those kinds of Labor independent challenges, depending on how things go over this next course of government and how they govern, that could become an increasing thing that we see in our elections as well. Because overall, the non-major party vote has increased again. So even though we've had this massive landslide, we've still got this non-major party vote that just keeps creeping up every time. It's it's like the boiling frog; it just keeps creeping up.
Absolutely. Simon, great to talk to you. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Laura.